Oh, hi. Didn't see you there. I'm Taryn, and the criminal justice system is a big deal. With effects on guaranteed rights like life or liberty, the rules and goals of this system are not trivial. But what are the goals? Well, most can agree that the criminal justice system should control crime to some degree. But there's also the rehabilitation and punishment of the offender to take into account. And all of this is wrapped up in the idea of due process, that the people in the system should be treated fairly and equally. So, any policies we make should be able to meet at least one of these goals, right? Well, that may not always be the case. Let's take a minute and talk about that.
In the mid-1990s, 24 states and Congress passed a series of similar laws with a somewhat bizarre name. They called the laws three strikes, referring to the baseball idiom of 3 strikes and you're out. But for the laws, it was more like 3 felonies and you're out. The laws created mandatory sentences for people convicted of 2 or 3 eligible felonies. For each additional felony, the sentence would go up. In many states, the sentence for 3 strikes was 25 to life behind bars. And the goals of these laws? They were created to target and punish habitual felony offenders, hoping to dissuade them from further crime, and by doing so, control crime.
So, the big question is, do 3 strikes laws actually meet their goals? In order to say that they did meet the goals, we would have to see some kind of substantial crime reduction effect in the jurisdictions in which the laws were implemented. Also, even if the goals were met, could it be possible that there were some unintended side effects? Well, to find out, we're going to have to turn to some research.
In 2006, Kopensick and colleagues set out to test the crime reduction benefits of 3 strikes. Specifically, they wanted to test if the laws had any significant deterrent or incapacitation effects. For 188 U.S. cities, they collected UCR crime rate data from between 1980 and the year 2000, focusing only on the most serious offenses.
Using this data, the authors were able to employ a research design that allowed them to treat the implementation of 3 strikes as a natural experiment. The 110 cities that had implemented 3 strikes were treated as the experimental group, and the 78 other cities were the control group.
Results of their analysis showed no support for deterrence and only leaned slightly to incapacitation. As a whole, they actually saw an increase in homicide rates for 3-strike cities. When separated out by state, about half the cities had an increase in crime while the others had a decrease.
So, the laws actually may increase crime rates? Alright, well that's not great. But how about the other effects? How are people treated under 3 strikes laws? Well, the process actually may be more punitive under 3 strikes. In 2013, John Sutton analyzed over 15,000 felony cases from the state of California. Since prosecutors in California have the discretion to decide what constitutes an eligible felony, any felony was grounds for inclusion in the study. For each case, Sutton gathered information about whether the defendant was sentenced to prison and for how long that prison sentence might have been. Sutton also looked at factors like race and the seriousness of offense. These variables were measured in the 4 years immediately before 3 strikes was implemented and the 4 years immediately after. Overall, his findings were somewhat mixed. For the average defendant, punitiveness generally increased after 3 strikes for both punitive measures. For black defendants, however, the average sentence length increased compared to the average defendants and Hispanic defendants. Now that's an interesting idea. Are some people treated differently than others? To find out, let's take a look at Elsa Chen's work. This author's 2008 study sought to examine the racial and ethnic disparities in 3-strike sentencing. Chen gathered data on over 171,000 California prisoners. This information included factors like the current offense and the type of sentence they received. Using this data, Chen ran a regression analysis. If no disparity existed, we would expect to see similar sentences given to people with similar legal variables. This is not the case though. Chen found that even after controlling for legal factors, blacks were more likely to receive 3-strike sentences than whites or Hispanics. Interestingly, the gap between males and females was even larger. James Austin and colleagues provide an interesting juxtaposition to the previous 3 authors. These authors attempted to discover what impact 3-strike laws actually had in states that adopted them. They argued that the legislation was largely symbolic in nature and that the scope of the laws was already covered in pre-existing legislation. In comparing pre-existing laws and three-strike laws, the authors found this to be the case in all states except for California, meaning that the adoption of three strikes changed almost nothing and had little to no impact in the states that adopted them. Now, California was an exception to this. The law in this state quickly became famous for how much more freely and severely it punished offenders than the previous laws. So in California, there may have been an impact, but that impact was not on crime. The authors found no crime reduction in California or the other strike states compared to other states. So the picture we have is very intriguing. At the aggregate level, three strikes laws either have little to no effect or have a seemingly random effect. At the individual level, people are feeling these effects, but not in a good way. People are punished more harshly, and there seem to be racial and ethnic disparities within that punishment. With the fact that the goals of the policies were not met, and that there are so many negatives associated with them, why were they even implemented in the first place? This is the question Karch and Cravens attempt to answer. In their historical analysis, the authors first examined the effects of state characteristics and external factors on the likelihood of a state adopting three strikes. The significant predictor in this model is the number of black residents, but only in states with a conservative leaning, suggesting that ideology and race were important when they interact. Second, they examined the likelihood that states would modify the laws. In this model, modification was predicted by left-leaning ideology, fiscal weakness, and a lack of stakeholder resistance. So, the moral of all this? Three strikes laws were not implemented because of necessity. Instead, ideological, economical, and external factors matter, combined with the fact that the goals of the policies were not met and that there are issues of race and liberty tied up in it. The legislator and we, the American people, should take a good hard look at these laws. We should look at them and ask, are they doing more harm than good? Again, I'm Taryn, and this has been a little over a minute, but thanks for watching.